This video was brought to you by Ground News. Amid an escalating political crisis, violence erupted during an anti-government demonstration in Bangladesh on October 28, as protesters gathered to demand the resignation of Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina ahead of the upcoming election on January 7th. And in the month or so since that demonstration, deadly protests and clashes have continued, leaving at least 16 people dead and more than 5,500 injured. Meanwhile, the government has been accused of an autocratic crackdown that has seen almost 10,000 opposition activists arrested, according to Human Rights Watch. So in this video, we'll explain the political crisis in the nation of more than 170 million people, go through the important background, and what all of this means for next year's election. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. Okay, so to begin with, we're going to explain a couple of key players and political dynamics that are central to this ongoing crisis. Since independence from Pakistan in 1971, Bangladeshi politics have been largely dominated by two parties: the broadly left-of-centre Awami League and the broadly right-of-centre Bangladesh Nationalist Party, or BNP. Now, this Awami League-BNP dynamic has, since the early 1990s, been dominated by an intense rivalry between two people: Sheikh Hasina of the Awami League and Khaleda Zia of the Bangladesh Nationalist Party. Hasina, by the way, is the daughter of Bangladesh's first president, and Zia is the widow of another former president. And this rivalry has even been dubbed the Battle of the Begums, with Begum being a word for a Muslim woman of high rank. But interestingly, both sides and their parties worked together in the 1980s to bring to an end the autocratic rule of General Hussein Mohammed Ershad. But since the 1991 election, the two have jostled for the role of prime minister. Zia and the BNP ruled from 1991 to 96. Then Hasina and the Awami League were in power from 1996 to 2001, before Zia returned to power and ruled until 2006, and then Sheikh Hasina came back to power after being re-elected in 2008, and has remained prime minister ever since. Now, this Awami League government, with Sheikh Hasina at the helm, has over the past decade and a half consolidated its power by cracking down on the BNP and wider political opposition. Since coming into power in the 2008 election, the Awami League has been re-elected twice, in 2014 and 2018, in elections that international observers described as seriously flawed. In 2014, the election was marred by violence and unrest and was boycotted by the main opposition alliance led by the BNP, resulting in the Awami League maintaining its parliamentary dominance. The following election in 2018 was contested by the BNP and opposition parties, but the Awami League won yet another landslide victory, with foreign powers like the US, UK and EU raising concerns about violence, irregularities and other significant obstacles to a level playing field. There has also been new legislation that critics point to as evidence of the Awami League cementing its control over the state. For example, the controversial Digital Security Act of 2018 is alleged to have had a draconian impact on press freedom, while a 2016 law controversially restricted the operational and fundraising abilities of NGOs. Throughout all of this, the so-called Battle of the Begums has effectively resulted in a victory for Sheikh Hasina, while the BNP has been left in disarray. In fact, Zia was even convicted back in 2018 on corruption charges, although her party say that they were politically motivated, and the US State Department noted that international and domestic legal experts had commented on the lack of evidence to support the conviction. As such, she's currently serving a 17-year sentence under house arrest with deteriorating health. Meanwhile, Khaleda Zia's son, Tariq Rahman, who has been the BNP's acting chairperson since 2018, remains in self-imposed exile in the UK, having been handed multiple sentences in absentia, including a life sentence relating to the 2004 Dhaka grenade attack. So, you get the idea. The BNP, Bangladesh's main political opposition, is not in a good state. And, well, that takes us to today and the upcoming election on January 7th. Now, the Bangladesh Nationalist Party are once again boycotting this vote, claiming that the election will not be free or fair if held under an Awami League government. The opposition is instead demanding that the government step down and be replaced by a non-partisan caretaker government that would remain in post for the duration of the election in order to ensure that the vote is held fairly. Now, this might sound unconventional, but for a period of Bangladesh's democratic history, it was actually the norm. The election of 1991 that restored democracy was held under a caretaker government. And then, in 1996, mass protests forced the country's parliament to adopt the principle of neutral caretaker-held elections in the constitution. Consequently, caretaker governments have overseen elections in 1996, 2001, and 2008, although the latter of these was held following a 2-year political crisis over the makeup of the caretaker government. In 2011, the Awami League government scrapped the requirement for a caretaker government to oversee elections, citing the previous political crisis and saying that we can't allow unelected people to oversee national elections. Opponents, like those in the BNP, decried the move though, saying that it would enable incumbent governments to rig future elections. As we said earlier, the BNP actually boycotted the 2014 election in protest, and then went on to contest the following disputed election in 2018, which they lost heavily. So, sensing that the country might be increasingly becoming a one-party state, and looking forward to the January 2024 election, the BNP views a 4th consecutive Awami League term as a foregone conclusion, unless a vote can be held under a caretaker government. But the BNP's demand for a caretaker government, mass protests after the 28th of October, and plans for a third of the country's registered parties to boycott the election have done nothing to move the incumbent government, which strongly rejects the demands. Instead, the result has been major crackdowns on opposition parties. On the streets during protests and strikes, clashes between opposition protesters, police, and pro-government protesters have injured thousands and left more than a dozen people dead. BNP leaders, including their Secretary General, have been detained alongside almost 10,000 opposition activists, and the party's headquarters have been sealed off by police, who've described it as a crime scene following the protests on October 28th. Now, there may have been a world in which an agreement between the government and BNP was reached and a competitive election was held, but room for any political agreement has all but closed, with hostility between the two sides at its peak, and the election drawing ever closer. For now, it appears that the BNP's main plan is to follow through with its boycott, continue and try to intensify protests, while also trying to draw a stronger international response, though so far, not much has actually changed. In the meantime, it looks set to be another ongoing political crisis in the turbulent region. Neighbouring Myanmar is in a full-scale civil war, while 2 borders away, Pakistan is experiencing its own political turmoil ahead of its elections in early next year. And as we said, things do seem to be escalating in the country too, with stories emerging of militants opening fire on a bus, killing 9 people, being widely reported on internationally and in the region. Now, of these reports, 23% is coming from the left, while 16% is coming from the right. And if you compare those headlines, you'll start to see some interesting framing emerge. And this is all possible thanks to our sponsor, Ground News, a website and app developed by a former NASA engineer on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, objective way to read the news. That's because every story comes with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality, and ownership of the source's reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. For example, for the story we mentioned earlier, you can see the bias distribution of every outlet reporting on it, the complete factuality information, and the ownership data. And with their new Bias Insights feature, you can even get a breakdown of the specific differences between left and right reporting. And I especially like their My News Bias feature, which allows you to track your reading habits over time. You can view your own personal biases, from specific news outlets and political lean to specific topics and locality. I can even see who owns the majority of news that I consume. Now, I know that I personally benefited enormously from ground news, and as a result, I've gotten much better at spotting political bias, and I've surprisingly challenged some of my own views. So I highly encourage all of our viewers to give ground news a try. In fact, we're offering 30% off their Vantage plan to all viewers. This includes unlimited access to every feature, including to My News Bias. That offer is only available here too, so make sure that you go to ground.news/TLDR or click the link in the description to get started for under $6 a month.